Welcome back to our deep dive into the document that is the crux of the civil case against Diddy. We are still going through all of the details of it. The document that's been filed by Mr. Jones against him and several other defendants. We're now up to line 140 as we continue to break it down. If you are just catching this, go back. There's already 4 previous segments that we've done going through the first part of this document. We're nearly halfway through. We have a lot to go. This is a large document. We're up to the point where the headline on this says defendants Ethiopia, Hadbert Merriam, Lucian Charles Grange, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group aided, abetted, and profited off Sean Combs' RICO enterprise. Let's take a look at this. Line 140. Mr. Jones recalls seeing defendant Grange visiting Mr. Combs' home in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California. According to Mr. Jones, whenever defendant Grange visited Mr. Combs at his homes, it would be in the evening, and he and Mr. Combs would disappear for hours in Mr. Combs' bedroom. Defendant Grange sponsored and attended several Love album listening parties at Mr. Combs' home in Los Angeles, California. These parties were sponsored by defendant MR, LR, and UMG. As evidence above, these parties had sex workers and underage girls present. During these parties, defendant Grange knew or should have known that Mr. Combs was drugging the attendees through laced bottles of Dalone tequila and Ciroc vodka. It's no secret that Mr. Combs had specific bottles of alcohol designed for females and other bottles designed for his staff, his artists, and himself. This fact was detailed by former artists and bodyguards of Mr. Combs. As a sponsor of these events, defendant Grange had a duty and obligation to ensure that sex workers and underage girls were not present and that Mr. Combs was not spiking the alcohol with date rape drugs. On YouTube channel The Art of Dialogue, former bodyguard Gene Deal exposed Mr. Combs' pill mixing method used to spike cranberry juice and orange juice. According to Mr. Deal, Mr. Combs would place ecstasy and other date rape drugs in the juices. On YouTube, The Art of Dialogue, former artist Mark Curry exposed Mr. Combs spiking bottles of Moet champagne in the VIP section of nightclubs. Mr. Combs would have a set of Moet champagne bottles for his artists and a set for women. Line 148, the writer has spoken with several former employees of Mr. Combs who witnessed defendant Kareem instruct her staff to lace champagne, Dalone, and Ciroc liquor bottles with ecstasy and other illicit drugs. Line 149, Mr. Jones recalls seeing defendant Hadbert Merriam visiting Mr. Combs' home in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California. According to Mr. Jones, whenever defendant Hadbert Merriam visited Mr. Combs in his homes, it would be in the evening, and she and Mr. Combs would disappear for hours in Mr. Combs' bedroom. According to Mr. Jones, defendant Hadbert Merriam visited Mr. Combs, the defendant, CRS, during Mr. Combs' writing camp. Defendant Hadbert Merriam sponsored and attended several Love album listening parties at Mr. Combs' home in Los Angeles, California. These parties were sponsored by defendants MR, LR, and UMG. As evidence above, these parties had sex workers and underage girls present. During these parties, defendant Hadbert Merriam knew or should have known that Mr. Combs was drugging the attendees through laced bottles of Dalone tequila and Ciroc vodka. As sponsor of these events, defendant Hadbert Merriam had the duty and obligation to ensure that sex workers and underage girls were not present and that Mr. Combs was not spiking alcohol with date rape drugs. Then we go to a section here, and if you're watching this on YouTube, you can see what I'm talking about. There's an image of Diddy, and I don't know if there's Hadbert Merriam with him, and then next to it a picture of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. Defendant, and here's the headline on it, defendant Christina Coram is the Ghislaine Maxwell to Sean Combs' Jeffrey Epstein. Interesting correlation here, and kind of sounds like that. According to Mr. Jones, in line 155, during the 13 months he lived and traveled with Mr. Combs, he witnessed Mr. Combs display and distribute guns from his bedroom closet in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, to questionable individuals all dressed in black. According to Mr. Jones, during the 13 months he lived and traveled with Mr. Combs, he witnessed defendant Karom openly order her assistants to keep Mr. Combs high off gummies and pills. Defendant Karom required all employees, from the butler, the chief of the housekeepers, to walk around with a pouch or fanny pack filled with cocaine, GHB, ecstasy, marijuana gummies, 100 to 250 milligrams each, and Tukey, a pink drug that's a combination of ecstasy and cocaine. And that can be argued. It's more of a synthetic type drug. It's interesting though that they had to keep him high. Like Diddy's, if this is all true, a pretty big drug addict and needs to be constantly on something. You know, I guess if all the allegations here are accurate and true, and he's doing all these horrible things, it's like he's having to live in this fantasy world of being drugged up. I don't know if it's just because he likes it, or if, you know, he dug himself so deep in that hole and now there's no looking up. There's no seeing the light. You're so deep. The only way you're going to feel any sort of anything good would be the drugs. I don't know. But it's interesting to me to hear that they needed to have him at that state. Line 158, it was important to defendant Kareem to give Mr. Combs drug of choice immediately ready when he asks for it. Defendant Kareem ordered sex workers and prostitutes for Mr. Combs. Defendant Kareem ordered and distributed ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms to Mr. Combs and his celebrity guests who were present on his rented yacht and his homes in L.A., New York City, and Miami. On multiple occasions, defendant Kareem forced Mr. Jones to carry Mr. Combs' drug pouch against his will. As the chief of staff in line 162, defendant Kareem was instrumental in organizing and executing the RICO enterprise. Defendant Kareem had the following individuals execute the following tasks for the RICO enterprise. A, Stevie J recruits sex workers and attends parties in, quote, freak-offs. And there's a notation as to what that is, and it says at the bottom of the page, we have a video of Mr. Combs, Stevie J, and Plaintiff Jones at a strip club. Mr. Combs is recording the video while coaching and training Plaintiff Jones how to recruit the sex workers. Justin Combs, B, solicits prostitutes, underage girls, and sex workers would engage in freak-offs. C, Brenton Paul works as Mr. Combs' mule. He acquires and distributes Mr. Combs' drugs and guns. He's the former basketball player that was also recently arrested. D, Frankie Santella works alongside Brendan while Brendan acquires and distributes Mr. Combs' drugs and guns. Frankie carries the money and pays for the guns and drugs. There's a picture of him and Brendan, and then we have the picture of him and Frankie. Moy Bond hires sex workers, attends and participates in freak-offs. There's another image here of Moy Bond, Thanksgiving of 2022, when Mr. Combs offered Mr. Jones cocaine. Line 163, Mr. Combs funded and used his affiliation with local gangs and gang leaders who would frequent his homes in L.A. and Miami to secure the drugs and guns he obtained and distributed out of his homes in L.A. and Miami. Defendants executed their RICO enterprise with threats of violence, threatening to eat plaintiff's face, displaying and distributing guns in plaintiff's presence, bragging about having law enforcement under control, bragging about murdering people, and bragging about bribing witnesses and jurors in the criminal case concerning the 1999 New York City nightclub shooting with Shine. Defendants executed their RICO enterprise with threats of isolation from the music and entertainment industries, parading powerful music industry executives such as defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia Habert Mariam, at his parties filled with sex workers, minors, and illegal drugs such as ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, ketamine, marijuana, and mushrooms. Defendants executed their RICO enterprise with threats of non-payment for work completed, fake promises of cash payments, $250,000, Producer of the Year Grammy Awards, and guaranteed access to future projects, and a $20 million home on Star Island in Miami. It's a lot to digest in that section of the document. Basically, they're basically teeing up a RICO case for federal investigators who are now looking very closely into Diddy with all of these allegations. It's going to be very telling what comes out of this and is who is all involved. If this is a world that's very insulated to Combs, where there's not a lot of people coming and going anymore from outside. I don't know about that. I mean, we have in this very document Cuba Gooding Jr. being named, several others redacted. But anybody who's been involved in Diddy's world, I think at any time in the recent history, they're probably also aware of some of these things and probably looking at this going, that sounds about right. It's my conjecture. Anyway, we have more to go through on this as we continue our reading. Mr. Combs is allowed to wreak havoc is the next section in line 167, where we will pick up next. Be sure to press subscribe wherever you download podcasts so you don't miss any of our coverage on this case or the many that we follow here for you at True Crime Today and the Hidden Killers podcast. I'm Tony Brueski. Stay with us.